So my name is Angelo Robledo, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about archaeology in the classroom, in education, especially K-12 education, um, which is for anybody that knows me or has seen my presentations before, not usually when I talk about it. I usually talk about atlatls, which uh, I thought about doing for today, but I wanted to switch it up a little bit. So about me, I was born and raised here in Las Vegas, and I did my undergrad at UNLV, where I studied anthropology, and then I went to Dublin, Ireland, to study at University College Dublin for their Master's in Experimental Archaeology program. I'm also on the board of directors for the World Atlatl Association, and I've been making and using and throwing atlatls and competing at atlatl events and giving speeches and presentations about atlatls around the country and world for like 12 years. It's kind of the main thing I do. And I've been involved in archaeology education in some way, starting in high school, really. And it started with atlatls, doing public outreach with the World Atlatl Association. But I've kind of moved into a more formal education role over the last couple years. And I currently work as the technology and experiential learning specialist at the Meadows School, which is an independent school in Summerlin in Las Vegas. So today there's going to be kind of like three broad sections. So first is just thinking archaeologically. And this is kind of, I know a lot of us have archaeology or anthropology backgrounds already, but this is kind of my perspective about what makes an archaeological way of thinking unique compared to other sciences or other academic fields. And then that kind of leads into the second section is like, why is that unique perspective, or why do I think that unique perspective is extremely applicable to K-12 education. And I'm going to talk about kind of two broad things that I do, object-based learning and experiential learning, and kind of talk about some best practices there. And then at the end, I'll do a quick little couple like case studies, a couple examples of lessons or projects I've done with students here in Las Vegas that could be expanded upon, and just kind of give you an idea of how I take these concepts and then apply them into actual curriculum development. So first, thinking archaeologically, this is my personal mantra of anthropology and archaeology. So humans create, humans use, and humans discard. This is kind of, I think this really sums up the human experience and is a huge part of what makes us us. I don't think really any other animals can be described in this way, right? Creating, using, and discarding things. We are obviously a very, very reliant on our material culture to survive. And I think that you'll kind of see how this kind of mantra guides through the way that I do a lot of other things. So when I talk to kids, I really try to get them to understand this universal concept of creation, use, and discard of stuff, of things that we use to survive. So again, we changed the material to ensure our survival. I forgot this slide was here. Okay, and then this, I really like this quote. Every culture, however primitive or advanced, is absolutely dependent on its artifacts for its survival and self-realization. And we're going to come back to McClung Fleming towards in the next section here. But he was a museum educator and anthropologist and wrote a lot about object-based education and archaeological-based education. So I think getting students to understand these kind of broader concepts is the ultimate goal. And where does this cycle start? As many of us are aware, starts with Homo habilis. Possibly, probably, one of the first hominids to make and use stone tools and first develop a stone tool culture with things like Alduin tools. And that cycle is older than our species, right? It's 2.5 million years old, way, way older. This usually blows the minds of both students and teachers and parents because of how generally unaware most people are about our actual evolutionary history. But the idea that this cycle goes back beyond our species and is part of our genus is something important that I try to stress to students and groups that I teach. And when you look at this timeline, you kind of quickly see that it's getting exponentially faster towards the end here. It takes 3 million years to go from the lower Paleolithic to the first metal, and then it takes 5,000 years to put a man on the moon. So kind of a really fast progression there. And again, just explaining the deep time concepts, I think there's this assumption that students, especially younger students, can't handle deep time concepts. I think that there are ways to introduce it to them where they can understand it. And I think archaeology is one of the ways that, because it's so physical, that it can be useful in that way. So these are just kind of small examples of things that usually really shock the groups that I speak to, just because of how I've realized over the years how generally unaware so many again families are about basic stuff like this. When you zoom into just kind of the Homo sapien timeline, 200,000 years ago, right, started in the Middle Paleolithic. Of course, we realize over the last 20 years of uh, anthropology research that there were multiple hominid species that were coexisting during these time periods that eventually narrow down to Homo sapiens. And again, we see that kind of exponential quickening of our material culture here. So this brings us to like how do archaeologists think? So one of the ways that I think archaeologists think is materially, especially because I come from an experimental archaeology background, which is very hands-on, thinking about the not just the artifacts that you have left over thousands of years, but all of the extra material that went into creating an object. For example, if we find a cast bronze brooch, early medieval, especially like Northwestern Europe, cast bronze brooch, that might be all we have left from the entire production process of that object. But there were other materials that went into creating that object as well. Obviously, you need to build some sort of kiln or forge to melt the metal. You also needed to create a clay mold, right, that would hold the cast. Those are things that end up getting destroyed throughout the production process, but were an important part of understanding what daily life was like for those people to create the objects that they created. So of course, here I have three ceramic vessels, and get students to realize that humans all over the world have used similar materials, or if not the same materials, independently of each other throughout time, and that there are these universals, right? So focusing on the universals and the differences that exist between people. So I think archaeology provides a unique way to do that through thinking about materials. And you can also think about functionality. So these are three different atlatls from three different time periods, from three different cultures, but they all serve the same function. So thinking about how different humans around the world solved the same technological problems or the same environmental problems with specific technology. And again, what is similar about these three different styles of atlatl, and then what are very, very different about these three different styles. So on the far left here, this is an atlatl from Alaska, and this was used for marine hunting. So you're in a kayak, maybe a 1 or 2 person kayak, and you're using this shorter atlatl. It's about 18 inches to throw a harpoon at a seal or a whale, which is going to be very different from this atlatl down here at the bottom, which is a very typical basket maker style atlatl. This is a replica of the Broken Roof Cave atlatl that was found in Arizona, and obviously not used for aquatic hunting here in the desert, used for terrestrial animals, 22 inches in length on average, 22 to 24 inches, and very flat and thin, little bit flexible, has this weight attached, but functionally does the same thing. It hurls a projectile towards an animal. And at the top, we have the two oldest atlatls ever excavated. These are from the Mazdazil cave in France, near Lascaux Caves, and part of the Upper Paleolithic finds there. And these are carved out of reindeer antler, and they are very short. They're only about 10, 12 inches long, but they would have been seemingly tied or attached to a longer handle. So again, we see a difference. Now, of course, these are from three different time periods as well. But thinking functionally, we can see similarities throughout technology, throughout time and history. We can also see differences. And small thing to note, small tangent, just because like this is a special interest of mine. Even though these atlatls were carved out of reindeer, in fact, of all the atlatl or atlatl fragments found in any of the Paleolithic cave systems in Spain or France, it's like 90-something percent, 95% of them were carved out of reindeer antler. except less than 1% of them actually depict reindeer. Many of them, if not all, most of them depict some sort of animal. Reindeer are very, very uncommon. So, and based on faunal assemblages from these caves, we also know that they're hunting mostly reindeer. So it's interesting that most of the material they're using is reindeer. What they're hunting is reindeer. What they choose to depict in art is not reindeer at all. So some small kind of interesting thing, and we see how much less decorated the other. I mean, the definitely the most intricately decorated atlatls that I'm aware of. I mean, the only thing that might come close to it would be the Aztec atlatl in the British Museum, but of course that comes from a state level society, so it's going to have a totally different feel to it. But in terms of foraging people, it's kind of remarkable that the oldest atlatls we have are the most decorated, and they seemingly get more functional, less aesthetic as time goes on. Speaking of time goes on, change over time. This is another, I think, core idea of archaeology, or the ways that archaeologists think about the past. So here we have the same material, same function, 3 different time periods, right? We have Aldebaran tools, we have an Acheulean hand axe, and we have a Solutrean blade. So they're all made from the same, flint or chert, essentially. And archaeologists are constantly thinking about the long changes over time, right? As well as the smaller scale. But really, I think archaeology provides a really broad view of history that can be, again, different from how a layperson may think about history or a student may think about history. And introducing some of these concepts to them early on, I've already seen unlocks a next level of critical thinking that they might either have developed later, might not have developed at all, or might not have developed until much later. Comparing and contrasting, this is kind of beyond archaeology. This is just a common one, but looking at specific landmark moments in history and thinking about how was life before and how was life after. What was life before the Neolithic? What was life after the Neolithic? What was life before the Bronze Age and after the Bronze Age? So, even though these events did not happen within one generation, right? We know that they're gradual changes that happen over time. There still was a time period where there still was a moment in history where there was no bronze, and then there was a moment in history when there was bronze. And thinking about what type of changes had to happen for that slow progression to occur, I think is another useful way of thinking archaeologically. Borrowing from anyone that's taken the lithics class will recognize this, but borrowing from experimental archaeology and lithics, the idea of chain repertoire, I think, is really interesting. An interesting way to think about the creation and use of and recycling of objects. So, of course, we have your kind of classic idea of chain repertoire as it applies to stone tools, where if you find a projectile point, it's very, very difficult to determine if the person that created that projectile point was intending to simply create a projectile point. There's a chance that this whole life cycle happened where a large biface blank got turned into a large thin biface that was used as a tool for some time until it broke and then was recycled to a projectile point. And we have evidence of people discarding points like this, and then different people thousands of years later picking up and recycling those points, or hundreds of years later recycling those points. So I think chain repertoire is an important concept to remember, that things are not static, things are dynamic. And coming to the chart on the left here, everything ends at deposition, but there is no real start. I mean, kind of procurement is a start, but you can go any direction here and make it to deposition. And you can go, and all of the arrows are bidirectional. So you can go hafting to use, back to hafting to use, back to hafting to use to deposition. It can begin and end anywhere. And again, thinking about the dynamic life of a technology or of a tool or of a material or of an object, as opposed to thinking about it statically. I think this is another important insight that archaeology provides. Okay, so taking those broad ideas of archaeology or archaeological thinking, and now applying them to education. I think there's kind of two main ways that archaeology can apply to education, and that's through object-based learning and experiential learning. Um, but first, why archaeology? And again, kind of summarizing what we just talked about, or what I just talked about. I really like the idea of archaeology as the science of history. It's not just what happened in the past, but it's how we know what happened in the past. You know, how do we know Julius Caesar was a real person and King Arthur was a legendary person? Material culture, right? We have physical evidence. We can archaeology is a science. And archaeology, again, allows students to reflect on this universal idea of creation, use, and discard, and thinking about how that process starts 3 million years ago with Homo habilis and continues with them today. Experimental archaeology specifically, I think, fosters an appreciation of craft, art, and technology because having a fuller understanding of the effort that goes into creating some of these amazing objects from history, and knowing all of that extra time and technology and knowledge that was needed to create those things can really help to combat the stigma of, you know, dumb cavemen in especially the Paleolithic. I don't think, just backing up here, I don't think dumb cavemen are able to make this. So you know, fostering that appreciation for the craft, I think is really important as well. Oh, and then also understanding that humans have been chasing utilitarian and aesthetic perspectives forever. I think, and you know, kind of in the same vein here. So thinking about materials used in the past, and then thinking about production time, labor, and skill. So again, these are concepts that are applicable to understanding our society today, and they're applicable to understanding humans throughout history. And then also archaeology. One thing I didn't kind of mention in the earlier section, but the idea of landscape and climate and that effect on humans is something that archaeology provides a lot of case studies for, right? What happens when you deforest? What happens when you don't figure out crop rotations? You know, we have examples of societies or cultures that have gone through struggle when the landscape or the climate changes, and thinking about the different technological solutions that humans have developed throughout the last 3 million years to solve those sudden changes in landscape and climate. And of course, archaeology, I think, really humanizes the past. That's a little circular. Okay, so object-based learning is a very hands-on approach so that you're getting students to think about the past via holding an object. And this really comes from that McClung-Fleming guy that I mentioned earlier, and draws from broadly anthropology, archaeology, and museum studies. And the McClung-Fleming model says that all objects have 5 properties and that we can use 4 modes of analysis to analyze each object. So I'm going to go through each one of these in depth here. So history, where and when was the object made? Who was it made by? Who was it used by? How long was it used? What happened when it was discarded? I think who was it made by and who was it used by is a really interesting thing to get students to think about, because especially when it comes to state level societies, the elite grave goods that are buried with the royalty of whatever society was probably not made by the person that used it, right? Or that wore it, or that was buried with it. And thinking about things like power structure or power dynamics and economics, and how craftspeople fit into an economy or society, and how that's been done differently throughout the world is an important concept. Of course, basic chronology and location and geography, where and when were things made. So some of this stuff is very obvious, of course, obviously for us as well, because many of us have backgrounds or already are interested in archaeology or anthropology, but forcing students or forcing museum patrons to really sit with each of these questions, right, and not just pass by a glass case of projectile points in a museum, but really spend some time and think about these questions, even if you don't have answers, right? Just think about what the answers might be or what that implication might be for people. Material, a little bit more straightforward. So what is it made from? Where did the materials come from? And is it a raw material or a refined material? Because again, this automatically leads to further questions about what that society was like. And thinking about this kind of comes back to the chain repertoire. You can see the connections there. But any object you have, there's a ginormous life story behind it that starts from when the materials were collected and ends with deposition. And there's so much to think about in that time period between those two things happening. And the more that you think about them, I think, again, the better appreciation you have for how people lived in the past. Construction, so how was it made? And then the real big one here, what background skills or knowledge were needed for construction? Because all technology is on this continuous upward climb where we're constantly learning from previous generations. So there had to be some sort of background skills or knowledge that were required for the next innovation. And thinking backwards, you're kind of able to reveal some of those and again think more deeply about how these things were made in the past. And I mean, as a kid, I was a big fan of the show How It's Made on, I think, Discovery or Science, and uh, especially in core countries, especially in Western countries, we are increasingly detached from the construction of stuff. We are increasingly detached from not only the geographic location where our clothes are made, but the people that make our clothes, right? And the processes that make our clothes. Even basic things, understanding like weaving, which is almost I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, but I think you'd be surprised, especially with young students who only know the digital world, or even young adults who only know the digital world, how utterly in the dark they are about even the most basic how things are made in the past or how things are made in the present. So getting people to really sit with that and think about that and research that is really important. Design, so kind of getting into the mind of why is this object the way it is? Not just how it's constructed, but what were the decisions that went into constructing it that way? Is it decorated or undecorated? What is the structure or form of it? Why is it shaped that way? And are the design elements utilitarian or aesthetic? So again, thinking about the choices that were made by the person making the object. And these are the things they would have had to think about. And then function, what was the object used for? What purpose did it serve? Did it have any unintended functions? This one's kind of basic. So those are kind of the 5 ways that we can analyze objects. And then McClung-Fleming provides 4 modes of analysis. So, and these go in increasing complexity. So you can apply these modes of analysis. You kind of go in order. So first is identification. This is just basic list of facts about the object. So you're not really doing a lot of critical thinking here. You're just laying out all the facts that you currently know about this object. Evaluation is comparing that object to similar objects from different time periods or cultures, as well as comparing that object to similar objects made from different materials. So this could be comparing if you're holding a stone projectile point, thinking about what a metal projectile point would be, or how different that would be, or why that would be different. Thinking about a stone projectile point, a bronze projectile point, and a modern steel broadhead, right? Thinking about comparing this object to how the object has changed through different time periods or different materials. Cultural analysis, so getting more abstract, getting more kind of critical here, thinking about the object in the context of the culture that made and used it. What did this object mean for the people that made and used it? Was this something that they would throw away, that doesn't matter? Is this something that holds a lot of extra meaning or value to that people or culture, and why, right? And then finally, interpretation. So this is thinking about the object in the context of our modern culture. This kind of can depend on the age of the object, but one of the things I get students to think about is like, why do we care about saving these artifacts in a museum? Like, why do we care about preserving the past? Why do we care about preserving objects or artifacts in a museum? So what role does having physical connections to the past serve our modern culture, our modern education, our modern society? So these kind of combine the 5 ways of analyzing objects and the four modes of analysis combined to this general object learning paradigm. So I like to add into this, or I kind of adapted the chain repertoire with the McClung-Fleming, and I just call these chain repertoire questions. And kind of a summary of everything we just talked about, but I think if you can ask this list of questions, and there's another slide here, of every object you come across, you really have a much, much better understanding of that object than, again, just passing by in a museum. And the benefits of object-based learning over traditional learning is the students are able to think about some of these things when they're able to hold the object. If they are looking at a picture of an artifact in a book, they have no sense of the weight or the density, what it feels like, how wieldy or unwieldy it would be, how big it is, right? There's usually not a scale for those pictures. So I don't mean, sorry, there is a scale for pictures of like published artifact. I'm talking about in students' textbooks. There's often pictures of artifacts with no scale, no context. I'm thinking right now, I mean, the fourth grade curriculum in Nevada for a long time has been Nevada history. And, you know, there's pictures of the Thule duck decoys from Lovelock Cave in the book because it's our Nevada State artifact. But the students have no real sense of how big they are, what they were like. It's kind of just a passing picture in the book. And I really think putting the object in their hand helps them think about these questions much more deeply. Okay, so different but related to this is this idea of experiential learning. So object-based learning is just one type of experiential learning. Going on a field trip is a type of experiential learning, for an example. And I really like kind of this summary from the Boston University Center for Teaching and Learning. So experiential learning cycle involves reflection, critical analysis, and synthesis. It requires opportunities for students to take initiative, make decisions, be accountable for results. Things like running a science experiment, right? Or having them do a self-directed project where they have to take initiative, make decisions, be accountable for results. Much better for learning than rote memorization, lecturing, things like that. Opportunities for students to engage with both themselves and each other in these, very important ways, intellectually, emotionally, socially, creatively, or physically. And it's a playground. It's a place where they can learn and they can make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and also succeed and learn from those successes. So there's kind of this cycle where, and again, there's no beginning or end. You can start really anywhere. Of experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting. So you might go on a field trip where you experience a farm. You might come back to campus and reflect about agriculture as a business, agriculture as a career, agriculture in the economy, the history of agriculture, agriculture's role in society. Thinking about maybe what are some current problems with agriculture, or what are some problems that farmers face, and what might be solutions to them, and then acting, encouraging students to, again, take initiative, make decisions, be accountable, and usually going through the actions leads to new experiences, and the cycle repeats. So I think this really relates, especially with, I mean, I'm a big fan of experimental archaeology as an important part of education, because the hands-on aspect of making your own stone tool, for example. I mean, you can excavate 1,000 arrowheads, and you'll never answer the question, how long does it take an arrowhead? How long does it take to make an arrowhead? The only thing that answers that question is making an arrowhead. So, make students make a pot, make a ceramic pot, and have them think about, ceramic pottery. We still use their plates at home are likely ceramic of some kind. Ceramic pottery has been a really important material for our species for a really, really long time. And up until pretty recently, if you think about the grand scheme of history, most humans were much more closer to the creation and production and discard and reuse of pottery than we are now. So I think this experiential learning, the experimental archaeology side of things, can really help out in this way. So that kind of brings me to just a few little example lessons or case studies that I've done with students at the Meadows School over the last... Technically, I started working with this object-based learning and experiential learning curriculum in 2019, I believe, while I was still an undergrad. And it was kind of just a small little workshop that I did one year, and then the next year the school was like, "Oh, that was pretty good. Can you expand it to be 3 days?" I was like, "Okay, sure." So we did 3 days of workshops, and eventually it became like a week long thing, and that happened in the fall around this time of the year. And I did it with second and fourth grade because it kind of just aligned with what they were already learning about in history class, and I went to Ireland, got my master's, came back, and they hired me full time. So I've been full time with them for the last 2.5 years, but I've kind of been in the orbit for the last 5 or 6 years. So here are two students of mine that are making their own rope from yucca. So we went on a hike in the desert. We used stone tools to cut yucca stalks, and and also dogmane, and we pounded it out, separated out the fibers, scraped it with stone tools, and then the students learned how to do a reverse twist. Reverse twist, right? The creation of cordage, the invention of rope, something that every society has figured out at some point. Every people has, going back, I mean, well beyond recorded history. And rope today, the rope you buy at Home Depot is reverse twisted using a machine, just not done by hand. But the process is the same. So getting them to think about that. Making clay pots, both pinch pots and coil pots, but especially coil pots. The kids love coil pots. Talking about pictographs, having them create their own pictographs, doing just, again, hands-on projects where they are pecking rocks and or making paint. We've also done projects of making pigment, throwing atlatls, which I'll show you in a second, writing on Greek tablets, making papyrus. I have more pictures of these. So yearly atlatl hunt, mammoth hunt that we do. Second grade class at the Meadows for the last couple years has done a unit about living humans in the Ice Age is their unit, or life in the Ice Age. They learn about the biology, the ecology, the climate, but of course the people. So this was kind of the start. This was the first little one day workshop where this teacher, Amy Ospey, had this idea of doing this long Ice Age unit. She's herself just interested and curious about anthropology and archaeology. She went on a family trip to the La Brea tar pits, got super into the Ice Age, and decided, you know what, I'm going to dedicate the month of September in my second grade class to learning about the Ice Age. And was able to, get in contact with me and invite me to talk to the kids about stone tools and about, of course, the atlatl. And students got to throw their own atlatl, and it kind of just became this big tradition at the school. So now we have students that are, in 9th or 10th grade that, still remember or still talk about throwing atlatls in second grade. We recently did a field trip, or actually, no, I'm sorry. A student of mine over the summer went to Mesa Verde National Park, and her parents were very excited to tell me on the first day of school this year that she basically gave an atlatl lesson to the park ranger, because she remembered so much and had learned so much from doing the atlatl projects with me in second and fourth grade. So atlatls come back in fourth grade for talking about Nevada history and talking about basket maker atlatls and the atlatls found in Lovelock Cave. So the kids kind of get to see, oh, atlatls in the Ice Age, and then 2 years later, oh, atlatls in the desert 10,000 years after that, and kind of have that experience of doing something a little bit different. This was a project I did with fifth grade last year, where part of the fifth grade curriculum is studying the regions of Native American groups around the country. I know it's always a tough, with education, there's always this push and pull, I think, between academia and education, where academia wants things to be very, very precise all the time, and broadly categorizing all of the diverse hundreds of Native American cultures into 5 regions or 6 regions is ultimately a disservice to students. And I think there's arguments for that for sure. At the same time, I think sometimes you just need to break it down into a a way that a third grader can understand or a fifth grader can understand. So really what I try to do is insert as much of the academic specificity as I can into the existing curriculum that's already built, that the teachers have been using for 30 years, because I can't convince them to completely scrap their social studies textbook for something else, but I can at least work with what they are working with. So what I did, there's 3 different 5th grade classes at the Meadows. There's 3 classes per grade. So when they were talking about Native American groups in the Northwest Coast in Alaska, of course, a common topic is totem poles. Now, as many of us know, not all groups in the Northwest Coast and Alaska use totem poles, right? So I decided to take this broad unit chapter that they were in and make it a little more specific. So what I did was create a presentation where I introduced 3 specific groups that use totem poles. I kind of explained, like, here's the general area where totem poles were used. It's not this entire broad area. But within that, even within that area, there's a lot of diversity. So I assigned one class to study the Tlingit, one class to study the Haida, and one class to study the Tsimshian. And then they had to create totem poles that were based on the specific artistic motifs from those groups. Again, not a generic totem pole, but actually research what were the differences between how these different groups produce totem poles, either in their artistic motifs, their color schemes, their carving styles, what they represented. This tied into a broader anthropological discussion about kinship, because ultimately what a lot of totem poles show are kinship structures, and getting students to realize the kind of nuclear family structure that we have in the Western world, especially like the anglicized world, is not how all cultures have structured their family. And I got the students to realize that, because we're a pretty diverse, multicultural school, that even within the classroom, not everybody's family had the same family structure. Some people lived with their grandparents. Some people lived with aunts and uncles. Some people just lived with mom, dad, and siblings. So getting them to think about, again, not just Native American groups in the Northwest Coast use totem poles, because that's way too generic and not really doing them any service. But totem poles were used in the Northwest in this specific area by these tribes. Here are these 3 specific groups or cultures that use them in distinct ways for distinct purposes. And it ties into this broader idea of kinship and family that is not only applicable to understanding how they lived in the past, but is also super applicable for us today and thinking about how we structure our families in society. So this was I think 2-week-long project where they created these totem poles. They're oatmeal canisters that are then painted brown and then kind of origami and cut and paste and glued paper bits to make the different animals' faces on the totem poles. 2 summers ago, I manufactured a class set of Greek wax tablets that were pretty accurate to what ancient Greek students would have used in their classes. Part of the Meadows core curriculum is all students take Latin, and then students have the option of taking ancient Greek in high school. So, all students take Latin in middle school, and then in high school they have the option of continuing with advanced Latin or pursuing ancient Greek. And the kind of classics department is really phenomenal. So I worked with them to create these wax tablets and also these oskriton. I always pronounce it incorrectly, somebody that knows Greek, but where the word ostracize comes from. So people, to vote out a nuisance member of society, they would take a broken pottery sherd from the ground and scratch with a bronze stylus the name of the person they wanted to ostracize or vote out. And this was called an ostraca or ostracon. I think it comes from like a root for a broken piece of pottery or something like that. So I created some ostraca and I created these wax tablets. And throughout the year, the students did their homework in the wax tablets and did their classwork in the wax tablets. But again, this is not just here, use a wax tablet because it's cool or because that's what people in the past did. There was a broader thing we're trying to get them to understand here, and that's the connection, the distinction between spoken language, writing system and writing medium, right? So our spoken language is English, our writing system is the Latin script, and our writing medium, well, nowadays is typing, right? Um, but you could say our writing medium is pencil paper, pen paper, things like that, compared to ancient China, right, where you have a writing medium of brush and paper, or Egypt, where your writing medium is stone and chisel, or of course Greece, where your writing medium is stylus and wax. And getting them to think about what is the relationship between writing medium and writing system. If you are carving into stone, if you're chiseling into stone, doing a curved line is pretty difficult. So you might, or scratching into a clay sherd, making a circle, making a perfect circle in this shape is kind of difficult. So it kind of makes sense that the Latin script takes a very angular approach because of the medium that they were using, and that in a lot of East Asian cultures that are using brush and paper, you're able to do a lot more flowy strokes. So you're going to see that reflected in the writing system. And again, understanding that the material aspect, the material culture, affects the material culture 3,000 years ago affects the writing system that we use today in 2025, and understanding that connection. So these are the students doing their classwork. They're copying their Greek notes into wax tablet. Similar concept in 6th grade. The students take an ancient civilizations course and talk about Mesopotamia, of course, and one of the biggest advancements to Mesopotamia, what Mesopotamia is really known for, of course, is the invention of writing. And we talk about cuneiform, and I bring in different versions of stylus, wedged stylus in clay. And again, this is kind of the first place where the students understand this idea or this distinction between writing system, writing language, and writing medium, because the writing medium of cuneiform, pressing a triangular or wedge stick into clay, was used by many different spoken languages and many different writing systems throughout history. Just like pencil and paper can be used to write many different languages. And getting them to think about how difficult and impressive it is that ancient Mesopotamian people wrote as many clay tablets as they did with tiny little stylus, dot, 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 pushing in these tiny little wedges. They realize how difficult it is, and just kind of adds to that idea of material culture impacting your culture today. And 3rd grade does a little unit on ancient Egypt. So this is a project where they are making papyrus. So it's brown paper bags cut up into strips and soaked in glue. But of course, before this, we watch videos of people making actual papyrus from actual papyrus plants. We talk about the papyrus plant. We talk a little bit about the writing medium, writing system, writing language thing. Of course, the students learn about hieroglyphs. And then once this is dry, this woven thing is dry, it actually really feels like papyrus. It really is impressive. So a week later, I come back and I teach the students how to draw in a cartouche, and they write their name and hieroglyphs inside the cartouche. So of course, you can kind of see I take the same idea of writing medium, writing language, spoken language, and I did it with 10th grade Greek students, 6th grade ancient civilization students, and 3rd grade students. So introducing breaking down the same concept at different ability levels, but still getting them to think about the same ideas, the same broad perspectives and ideas. I think, yep. And then this is, anybody that kind of works in archaeology education has come across this project or this activity before. Cookie excavation. So this is less about a specific culture or time period or geographic area of the world, and more about archaeology as a science and how do archaeologists excavate. And what I do is I place this chocolate chip cookie on the top grid, and then the students have to create a little map of where they find chocolate chips throughout the dirt, which is the cookie crumb. They have a little backfill pile right here. So this is their backfill of cookie crumbs, and then their artifacts, which are the chocolate chips, get collected over here. just gives them a small way to think about excavating very slowly. So we talk about, digging through the cookie. Vincent here didn't quite follow directions, but Jude's doing a great job here, scraping layer by layer, getting the top layer off the cookie first, then the next layer. We don't want to disturb any chocolate chips before we can mark them in our map here. And yeah, just getting them to think about archaeologist science. I would love if Meadows would let me build a custom archaeology sandbox on the playground. Would be amazing, where I can bury artifacts and have kids excavate and string up excavation units. These are my pie in the sky kind of ideas. There is an elementary school in China that last year, or yeah, a year and a half ago, opened up the first K-12 experimental archaeology research center in the world. And they have they focus on Bronze Age China. So they have a pottery kiln and they have a bronze forge, and students have the ability to make their own replicas of artifacts, of course with supervision of adults. But they're like 8th grade students that are casting bronze artifacts, which is really amazing, giving them a huge appreciation for the material past of their people. And it's a program that's working in conjunction with the one of the archaeology museums there. So they actually have a mini museum on campus of not only artifacts that are on loan from the museum, but also artifact replicas that students have made, which I think is really cool. And they have a library. They have like a large archaeology library and some really cool kind of projector things that can do 3D modeling or 3D projections of artifacts or kind of photogrammetry type stuff. I do have pictures from the article of that Chinese school, but I forgot to add it into this presentation. I apologize. But it was published in the EXARC journal, Experimental Archaeology Journal, in I want to say September 2024. So you'll be able to find it. The pictures are really cool. There's a few pictures of students that are like wide-eyed, like full Home Alone, watching bronze get poured, which I think is really cool. Something that again would have been pretty typical to see if you lived back then, but is very atypical for us to see now. But an important part of understanding what metallurgy is and where metal objects come from. So that's the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing here